I want to look at the ongoing conflict with China through a different lens. And I really want to highlight just how fragmented our relationship with them has become. So a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Janet Yellen made a trip to China. Now, the timing of the trip was a little strange, or not a coincidence, as I like to say. Her trip comes just days after China announced export controls on gallium and germanium. These are two key inputs into semiconductors. Essentially, you need this to make the semiconductors. And this restriction from China was a response to the U.S. restriction on what type of semiconductors can be sent to China. So there seems to be a growing amount of tension, but despite that, Janet Yellen insisted the U.S. has no interest in decoupling. Meanwhile, we're onshoring a bunch of factories and we're bringing over essentially our work back on American soil. Sure. Now, it is important to note that based on a former CIA expert on China, Dennis Wilder, the Chinese leaders actually see Secretary Yellen as one of the most pragmatic and less political senior officials in the Biden administration. Okay, I guess it's a really low bar. Worth highlighting, though, that Xi Jinping continues to not meet with Joe Biden. I know that that's a conversation that the two governments are having. At least the U.S. is trying to push for that meeting. China couldn't be bothered, to say the least. But what's really interesting is what the Chinese media is saying about this meeting. And, one state-owned media outlet, Xinhua News Agency, described the conversations that Yellen had with the senior Chinese officials as constructive. And another one, the Global Times, quoted Premier Li Qiang as telling Janet Yellen that China-U.S. ties can see rainbows after a round of wind and rain. Okay? So that means China sees our current relationship as that akin to being in the middle of a storm. Okay, that's not an ideal place to be with someone where you're asking them for a whole lot. Then you got to understand what it is we're asking them. Well, Janet Yellen went over there on a climate crusade, but she wasn't the only one. We'll get to that in a second. Yellen met with climate finance leaders and suggested China support efforts like the Green Climate Fund and the Climate Investment Funds to address the effects of climate change on developing countries. She was going there to essentially highlight the fact that, hey, between the US and China, we produce about 40% of these greenhouse gases. So if we were to make significant changes to our policies, we could theoretically really have a substantial impact on at least this aspect of greenhouse gases going out into the world. But Janet Yellen wasn't the only one. Remember John Kerry? Well, he also found himself in China, and he went to discuss climate change. Oh boy, John. Well, turns out that China didn't really care. In fact, senior leader Li Shuo, the senior climate advisor with the environmental group Greenpeace in Beijing, was quoted saying, further engagements should help unlock more ambition in reducing coal consumption, cutting methane emissions, and beating a path towards a stronger outcome at COP28, a climate summit that's going to be in Dubai later this year. I want to unpack this quote, though, because what this person is saying is that they're not saying, hey, we're going to use less energy. No, we're just going to move off of coal. What they're not saying is, hey, we're going to, whatever energy we would have been using through coal consumption, we're going to use that energy, but we're going to find a different way. And then cutting methane emissions. Look, I and Mark have talked a lot about this, but there is clear evidence showing you how Bitcoin mining is actually taking these flared methane gases and essentially opening the door for reducing emissions, finding stranded energy, and then creating hard sound money as a result. Now, if you're actually familiar with China and Bitcoin and their sort of intertwined history, you'll know that technically, as of this recording right now, China has banned Bitcoin. And yet Hong Kong is slowly exploring ways for people to get exposure to Bitcoin. It is also worth noting that China had previously already banned Bitcoin and then unbanned it only to then reban it. So could we actually be seeing steps being made to potentially have China adopt Bitcoin, become a global leader in Bitcoin mining? This is pure speculation, but the fact that they're highlighting cutting methane emissions, to me, that feels like a very straightforward, hey, we can continue to use the energy output. We're going to need more energy if we want to expand our country and continue to grow. And there are ways to do that are economically viable. But the weird thing is, these were not the only two U.S. government officials to go to China. In fact, Henry Kissinger, which, if you may not realize, he was instrumental in helping to arrange President Nixon's visit to China. Henry Kissinger actually made a visit to China, and he actually met with a senior defense minister. It wasn't like he was on vacation. He seemed to be going there and having very clear-cut political and strategic conversations. Kissinger met with the Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu in Beijing last Tuesday. And it's almost so crazy, but it gets crazier because Li Shangfu refused to meet the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at a regional security forum in Singapore just a month ago. We're at a point where the Chinese officials are saying, no, I don't want to talk to this one. Bring me back Henry. Bring me back Henry Kissinger. It would probably be a bad time to admit that I was surprised to know that Henry Kissinger is still alive. The man is 100 years old. He has done a lot for this country, but he is not actually a member of our government today, right now. But the fact that other countries do not view our current leaders, who will not meet with Joe Biden, who will not meet with the current defense minister or defense secretary, but will meet with former ones, is very telling about what place the U.S. has. Now, it is important to know that during all of this, there have been some economic news coming out of China, specifically that their exports have fallen the most in 3 years. Specifically, exports from China have suffered a severe decline, plunging by 12.4% year over year in June after a 7.5% decline in May. So you're looking at almost, I think when I calculated it out, it came out to like 18% decline in just exports. And then not to mention the fact that imports are also experiencing a sharper contraction than expected, declining by 6.8%, surpassing the predicted 4% decline. So China's exports to the U.S. saw the sharpest decline amongst its top trading partners, down almost 24%. So no matter what Janet Yellen is saying, the proof is in the pudding, and the numbers don't line up. It is very clear that U.S. businesses and regulations are impeding the trade agreements. And China's response is, okay, if you're going to put these hamstrings on us and tie our hands behind our back, we're going to do the same to you. So time will tell as this continues, but I don't think that the relationship between U.S. and China has magically been solved or fixed. And it is very telling that the Chinese officials are only willing to meet with certain U.S. officials, and it's very specific Chinese officials. It's not Xi Jinping meeting with Joe Biden. It's not Xi Jinping, frankly, meeting with anyone from the U.S. government. So time will tell, to say the least.